those of you who do not know me, and that's not many, my name is Dr. Charles White. A little about me: I had a career in the Navy. Spent 22 years. I worked with the Navy Special Operations people and also served on submarines. After getting out of the Navy, I had a career in law enforcement. I served with the Orange County Sheriff's Office of Florida for 15 years. When I retired from that, I have a PhD in counseling. So today we're going to talk about child physical abuse. So let me start this by asking you a question. What is child physical abuse? How do you define that? And don't everybody raise their hand at one time. How do you define that? Is there a difference? Is there a difference between physical abuse and corporal punishment? What's the difference in that?
That's something we need to talk about.
That's a huge problem, because some parents, if they have a Christian ethic to themselves, will tell you that corporal punishment is perfectly okay. And I was raised with corporal punishment. I turned out okay.
Me too.
You know, most of us seniors did. All right, but the big problem is how do we make that definition? Because some parents will say, "You're abusing my child, well, I'm going to have you arrested." Where he says, "I just exercise corporal punishment like I'm supposed to." So the definition, if you read on your little flyer here, he says the precise definition of child physical abuse varies among states. So one state may see it as abuse, where another state may not see that at all. Depends on where you're at. The District of Columbia and the U.S. territories, all these entities agree that physical abuse occurs when a parent or caregiver commits an act that results in physical injury to a child or adolescent, such as red marks, cuts, welts, bruises, muscle sprains, or broken bones. And even if the injury was unintentional, physical abuse can occur when physical punishment goes too far. We just talked about that. All right? I mean, Johnny shows up at school one day and he's got a broken leg. You know? Somebody needs to ask the question, "Gee, Johnny, what happened to your leg?" You know? Try to communicate with him. See what's going on in his family. You never know. Or he may just fell down the playground and broke his leg. And that's okay too. But you should always ask that question, what happened to you? You know. How big is child abuse? Consider the following. Approximately 4.10 million referrals alleging child maltreatment were made to CPS agencies last year.
In 1 year?
In 1 year. 4.0 million referrals. Now, in a nation of, I don't know, how many people we got, 300 million here or something like that? That's still a lot. That's a lot. Referrals involved roughly 7.2 million children, and subsequent investigation verified that approximately 683,000 of these children were victims of maltreatment. You'll often find where there is physical abuse in the family, there's all kinds of dynamics going on in that family. You will find that mom and dad are unemployed. You will find that there's no income coming in the family and they depend on social services. You will find that it sometimes involves parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles of some member of that same family. There's all kinds of dynamics you got to look at. What happens is dad physically abuses his daughter. And you look back in his history and you find out that his mom used to physically abuse him. So he thinks that's perfectly normal. After all, that happened to me and, you know, I turned out okay, or at least he thinks so. All right? Most of these children were victims of neglect, i.e. they didn't eat well, the household was a mess, the parents either had an alcohol problem, drug addiction problems, and it goes on and on and on. With physical abuse, 17.2% of those, and sexual abuse, 8.4%, being the next more frequent type of child maltreatment. And remember, these are conservative numbers. This is what actually gets reported. Consider that this number is probably twice that from families that never get any kind of intervention. Nobody knows what's happening because the doors are closed in that family. It's a very reserved family. They don't share stuff with their neighbors. They don't communicate with the public. They just stay in their house. And it goes on and on and on until somebody either gets really, really physically hurt or somebody ends up dying. Infants under the age of 1 experience the highest rate of victimization per 1,000 children. Now, can you imagine somebody physically abusing a child that's under 1 year of age? 1 year of age. But, it's hard to wrap our head around that, isn't it? How could somebody do that to a child that young? It's just awful, but it happens all the time. All the time. That's because in our society we have fentanyl problems, we have drug problems, we got alcohol problems. Professionals were the reporters in most of the cases, 63.4%. Alleged abuse and neglect, with the largest numbers of reports by professionals coming from education personnel, legal and law enforcement, and social services. The biggest plus you can have looking for physical abuse of kids is in your public school system. It always will be. Why? Because they spend half their day there. And you can notice a change in their behavior. Johnny was really a good kid. He always did well in school. Now he's failing and he doesn't talk to anybody. He stays huddled in a corner in the back of the room. You can notice these things in your public school system, and then the teachers make referrals. And it goes to the principal. And from there it goes to the social worker. And from there it goes to the criminal justice system and the court system. And all down that line, the child is being abused time and time and time and time and time again because they have to relive it how many times? And that's terrible. So our system needs to find a more efficient and more effective way with dealing with this. Particularly in court, where the child can sit on the stand because the alleged perpetrator has every right. That's what the law says. And they can drill her and drill her and drill her or him until it gets all confused. And the jury says, well, I don't know. What some states have done, what Florida does, is that the victim is in a room and is being televised through a camera to a different room where the court is. So that child doesn't have to look at him at all. Doesn't have to even see his face. That's the last thing their child needs to see. African American children experience the highest rate of victimization, 14.5% per 1,000 children in the population of the same race or ethnicity, following the American Indian, Alaskan Native children, Hispanic children, and whites, of course, are last. Why do you suppose that is? This is an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Why is it that African American families have more cases of physical abuse of their children than any other ethnic group in this country? What's that make the case for? That we're not paying enough attention to the others? That they're afraid to come forward and say something? How can you tell they're being physically abused? It can be difficult to determine from a child's behavior or emotional state whether abuse has occurred. The best way to know if a child's been abused is the child tells you. If they're a little hesitant, if you ask them, are you okay? Because he keeps on touching his arm or something, you set him down and say, are you okay? I mean, What's going on with your arm? You know? And young children, elementary school children, if they tell you something, just like in sexual abuse, if they say something to you, they almost never lie. They won't lie to you. They almost tell you right up front what's going on. They haven't got the hesitation you and I do. They will tell you every time. If you're in your church and you see a child that's limping around or something's going on with that child, set them down. Ask them in a quiet room. If he looks at you and doesn't want to say much, then I promise you something's going on. Frequent physical injuries that are attributed to the child being clumsy or accident prone, and that can happen. That can happen. Very, very easy. Kids are out playing in the playground, they fall, trip, skin their knees, break a bone. Happens all the time. Doesn't mean they're being physically abused at home. Injuries that do not seem to fit the explanation given by the parents or the child when you interview the parents or the principal does or the social worker does at your school. And you have already interviewed the child, but the parents are telling them there's something very different than what the child said. And if that's the case, then you can bet your bottom dollar that child's being physically abused. You can bet on it. And then that starts the whole process of intervention in that family. And you may end up removing the child from the family. That may end up happening. Conflicting explanations provided by the child or caregivers. Explanations that do not fit their injuries or injuries attributed to accidents that could not have occurred given the child's age. For example, immersion burns on a child too young to talk or crawl. Burns on them, cigarette burns, things like that. If they're too young for that, if this child's 2 years of age, they couldn't have very well have done that. And when the parents say, oh, he did it, I left a cigarette on the table. The child couldn't get to the table at all. Habitual absence from or lateness to school without a credible reason. That child comes one day, he's gone for 2 days, he comes back another day, he disappears for a week, he comes back again, so on. Somebody needs to ask the question, why? Why are you always gone? And the child will tell you if he's young enough. If he's in high school, they may never tell you. But if he's young enough in middle school and elementary school, they'll tell you why. Because Dad keeps on hurting me. Really? Well, how does that happen? What's he do? And the child will tell you what Dad's doing, or Mom's doing, or Uncle John's doing, or Grandpa's doing. Okay? It could be any member of that family. All right? Parents may keep a child home until physical evidence of abuse has healed. So you got some bruises. Well, he's not going to go to school until those bruises heal. And Dad, Mom, or whoever it is will always say, you know what, I'll never do that again. Never. I promise you, I will never do this again. And then they do. It's the behavior that needs to be corrected through therapy, not something they can just get over. That doesn't happen. All right? So they tell you, I will never, ever, ever do this again. Don't believe them. Don't believe them. What should you do if you suspect physical abuse? Somebody tell me.
Talk to the child.
Talk to the child. Okay, and what else should you do?
Just don't ignore it and observe for a while, maybe.
Yeah, but something really important you're missing. What are you missing here? What's important that you do?
You need to report it.
Yes. Thank you.
What'd you say? Yeah.
You got to report it.
Oh, yeah.
You call the hotline that the state has. You don't have to give your name or anything else. They have no idea who you are. And you give them the information you know about this child. And then they allow social services to come out and take a look at this kid. That you have to do. You say, well, they might sue me. In this state, and every state in this country, if you make a genuine, honest referral, you cannot be civilly sued. Cannot. State statute says they cannot sue you. Even if you're wrong, state says you cannot sue you. The last thing you want to do is let somebody sue somebody, and that'll completely erode away that system. Now nobody's going to call. All right? What should you do? If you are a counselor, parent, teacher, or anyone else concerned about a child whom you suspect is being abused, the best way to begin is by talking to the child. You're the first step in that intervention. And if that child tells you something, and that says, for instance, Kim, that child says, Miss Kim, can I talk to you for a minute? And the child reveals something to you, that child trusts you, absolutely trusts you, and you stay with that child. I don't care if it's clear through the criminal justice system. That child trusts you. And you're responsible for that child because they do. Don't walk away and say, I can't. This is it. I'm done. I'll give it to these guys. And that child said, I don't know who these guys are, but I know you. And you listen to me when nobody else would. You stay with that child through the whole system. That's very important. All right? Stay with an open question. Don't assume that the child is being abused. There may be explanations why the child is behaving in a given way or how a child was injured. Some children have conditions that make them more vulnerable to bruising and broken bones. What this essentially is saying is don't assume that has happened. Don't immediately, see, I know he's being abused. Well, how do you know that? How do you know he doesn't have some kind of disease that makes him vulnerable for bruises and broken bones and other things? You don't know that unless you ask the family, do you? If that's the case, then it is what it is.
Can you give an example of open-ended questions?
How often does this occur? How do you feel when that happens to you? What are your emotions telling you? How do you feel inside when somebody hurts you like that? If you're being hurt at all. How do you feel? And most children will be a little hesitant, not sure how to answer that question. But then eventually you'll come around and say, God, I just want to hide. I want to run away from home. You know, just like in sexual abuse victims, a lot of these kids you find on the street today, many of them have been victims of physical abuse. And nobody's intervened in their behalf. If the child has a visible injury, ask the child how they were injured. Ask them. Who hurt you? Did you fall down the playground? How'd you do that? And you say, well, I fell down the playground. Well, as John comes to school occasionally with bruises, and he can't always be falling down the playground. Something's going on in that family. All right? Don't assume he's out there hanging from trees and falling down. That may not be true at all. All right? Ask open-ended follow-up questions to look for inconsistencies if the explanation for the injury seems implausible or doesn't match the injuries. If he has a broken leg, well, what happened? Well, he slipped. Well, in most cases, when you slip, you're not going to break your leg. You know, you're not going to break your arm. You're not going to have an injury in your head and things. Children are pretty pliable. I mean, if they fall, they don't fall like you and I do. They fall and they can recover really easily. All right? If you suspect physical abuse, reporting such to the state agency is mandated by law. You have to do that. If they find out that you knew about this abuse and you failed to report it, you can be arrested. As in sexual abuse, if your referral is genuine, you cannot be held civilly liable. If the child reveals physical abuse to you, it's important that you believe the child. Always believe the child. Don't sit there and go, nah, I don't think that could happen. Really? Believe what that child's telling you. By revealing such information to you, they have placed their trust in you. And from that point on, you are their advocate. I don't care if it's through the criminal justice system. I don't care if it's through social services. I don't care what it is. You are their advocate because that child trusts you. And this can happen in churches. This could happen in public education. This can happen different kinds of social programs, camp. You can go on and on and on. You got to pay attention to these kids. Because if we don't, this is never going to end. No, the federal government, for the most part, leaves it up to the states. And it should. There's no consistency, though, in it. Each state is different than the next one, than the next one, than the next one. All depends on how they want to define that. You know, if a state is fundamentally conservative, then they're going to be like Tennessee and others, and Texas and Florida. Then their laws are going to lean towards a balance in the approach of the abuse. If the state's very liberal, like California and other ones, they'll lean to the left and they'll just believe the child, and it doesn't matter what the perpetrator had to say. They just believe them without really investigating thoroughly what happened. Now, I'm not saying it happens all the time. In fact, it happens rarely. But it can happen because they let their politics and their ideology and everything else get in the way. Everybody wants to help kids. I don't care who you are. How we go about helping children is very different in every state. So it's in your best interest to look at Tennessee, see how Tennessee does that, and you can be prepared should that ever happen to you. Okay? Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you for coming.